Welcome to Babblecom 5. This is episode 18 of season 3 of Babylon 5, Walkabout. Londo is incensed by a Narn heavy cruiser, the one shielded by Sheridan in season 2, being parked alongside the station, demanding to know from Garibaldi what assurances he can give that he won't open fire on Centauri craft. Garibaldi says they need all the ships they can get for defence, and he'll give him the same assurance he gave him about no Narn slitting his throat at night while he sleeps. Londo protests that he has been given no such promise, to which Garibaldi tells him to sleep tight. Lita goes to Medlab to try and find out if anyone witnessed Kosh's death, which is still a secret, but learns that Franklin is on leave. She describes herself as his aide, and is told that by the time the med team arrived it was already too late. She leaves disappointed. A dark red and orange Vorlon ship comes through the gate, and Ivanova says to Garibaldi that she'll tell the captain, but he says he'll do it. When pressed, Garibaldi explains that Sheridan has gone for a walk to clear his head, in space, on the forward cargo stabilizers. As you do. On approach, the Vorlon ship pauses, then translates upwards to Sheridan's level, displays Vorlon symbols and extends its forward tendrils in something approaching a salute as Sheridan watches on. Jakar is sharing a meal of the apparently universally constant Swedish meatballs with the captain of the heavy cruiser. The Narn only have around a dozen ships of various classes left, but the Centauri were moving so quickly that other ships were left disabled rather than destroyed, and they are now being repaired using parts from others. So no counter-offensive is currently on the cards, but they will once again have something approaching a space force. However, Jakar's current focus is clearly on protecting the station. Sheridan joins Ivanova to greet the new Vorlon ambassador, noting that Garibaldi has gone to find Franklin because his quarters haven't been used in days. Sheridan now wishes he'd gone to see him after his resignation, and confesses he just didn't know how to react to the revelation of his stim addiction. The new ambassador wears a distinctly different encounter suit to Kosh's, almost sinister. Ivanova plays back that Kosh's death is a secret, and confusingly he says that they will call him Kosh, even in private, intoning that we are all Kosh. This they take as proof positive that he is indeed a Vorlon. Simply put, as Garibaldi requests having caught up to him, Franklin is on Walkabout. As a Foundationist, he was taught that you can lose yourself in the world. You take a left, but the most important part of you takes a right. So he's aiming to meet himself, metaphorically, to discuss who he is when he's not being a doctor, and in doing so to become his whole self again. Garibaldi doesn't really see it, but this is what he's committed to. The new Vorlon scans Kosh's quarters and identifies shadow signatures before confronting Lita in an angry fashion, choking her, but she has chance to explain that she was off station as Kosh had asked her to go but had no piece of him with her. So he is truly lost, and she knows of no other that was with him. She is released and commanded to follow. Lita and Sheridan catch up about the new ambassador, and she notes that for their strengths, the Vorlons are quite delicate. They do not react well to change, and none of them has died for a very long time. Lita seems distracted, and hears Sheridan ask a question in Kosh's voice before he repeats it in his own, and she responds that she's fine. He then asks her to do something for him, but we don't hear what. There's then a Babylon 5 just top of the pops scene, as Franklin becomes smitten with a singer as he pauses on his walkabout. In the War Council, Sheridan is outlining his plan to test whether a shadow vessel can in fact be jammed by a telepath. Lita has agreed to come with, but while Sheridan was keen to maintain a skeleton crew, Ivanova and the others require him to accept additional telepaths on standby, while Delenn and possibly Jakar will send ships in support in case the White Star's firepower is insufficient. Interesting to see the wheels turning, because Ivanova basically leads a revolt against his intended methodology. Franklin meanwhile is in pickup mode, and morphs into Steve because Kaylin the singer had a bad relationship with another Steven in the past. They seem to hit it off with his gushing over her talent, and she is impressed by him being a doctor. Elsewhere, it seems that the Jatok's captain is not entirely on board with the idea of helping Sheridan, as he's recovered records from their ship's previous encounters with shadow vessels that did not end well. It's sector 90 by 110 by 47. The White Star awaits a shadow attack report in hyperspace with the Minbari cruiser, preparing to jump into normal space. Sheridan wishes he had more ships, but feels this needs to get done. On the bridge of the White Star, Lita watches on. Franklin's evening continues as Kaylin regards him through a glass, testing a theory of hers designed to look into people's souls. All she sees is pieces, which Franklin actually thinks is pretty apt, but she was hoping for a more romantic response. Garibaldi wrecks Jakar's beauty sleep by demanding to know why the Jatok is still parked outside the station. Jakar explains that Walid and Nakal felt they needed to conserve their resources, which infuriates Garibaldi, who points out that Sheridan put the station's pilots on the line defending the ship when he had very little reason to do so because it was the right thing to do. Garibaldi further points out that Nakal doesn't see the big picture, whereas Jakar does, so it's Jakar's call to order them in, not Nakal's, and off he storms. Franklin has now gotten intimate with Kaylin, but when he asks if there's anything he can do for her, she asks for a prescription drug and he is immediately defensive, also saying she'd do better to drink less if she wants to sleep better. She calmly points out that he asked, as in she didn't, and they return to sleep. Lita discusses how Sheridan knew Kosh had died, and he says honestly that he woke up out of a dream and just knew, that he imagined as Kosh had touched his mind before, he was sensitive to him. Lita admits to some guilt over not being there, and Sheridan tries to reassure her that there was nothing that she could have done. Then Lanier picks up a signal, the shadows have struck, and Sheridan takes the White Star in. Sure enough, a Drazi Sunhawk is kebabbed by a shadow vessel against the background of a nebula as the White Star jumps in, but as Lita reaches out to try and start jamming it, she physically crumbles to the ground, recoiling, clearly unable to deal with what she's touched, and the shadow vessel changes course to intercept them. As Sheridan kneels with her and grasps her hand, she sees flashes of Kosh's death and gets back to her feet, intoning that they killed him, tore him apart, and then she establishes her focus on the shadow vessel and says, "Burn, you bastards." And she succeeds in locking them up, as fortunately the White Star has forward windows that give her line of sight. Lanier confirms the ship is motionless, and Lita tells them to act quickly. Sheridan orders their main gun to open up continuously, then orders Mr. Lanier to dump more power in to try and get the job done, which means they won't be able to jump for 20 standard minutes. This succeeds, and the shadow vessel begins to crumble as Lita holds a console for support. She's okay, but weakened by the effort needed to keep it in check. On the station, Kaylin gets dressed and takes something from Franklin's bag before leaving her quarters. Sheridan asks Lita what she felt, and she said she could feel it shifting in her mind, trying to get loose, and while she managed to hold it, she thinks it sent out a distress signal. There are still 10 minutes before they can jump, and it's too late. No less than 4 shadow vessels phase in, clearly determined to stop the results of Sheridan's experiment from getting out. Sheridan orders Lanier to run as a additional jump point opens, bringing in the Minbari cruiser, but it only has 3 telepaths on board. They're 1 short, but they'll do what they can. It's not enough. Whilst they can hold 3 of the ships, the other breaks loose to chase down the White Star, whose weapons aren't sufficiently recharged to do it damage. Lita is too drained to break through its defences too. Then another jump point opens, and the Jatok emerges to immediately fire on the shadow vessel. Sheridan orders Lanier to combine their firepower quickly with it, and the combination is successful. Jakar isn't on board the heavy cruiser, however, and he's brought a fleet with him that now jumps in behind the White Star. To Lanier's surprise, the remaining shadow vessels flee. Lita hears Kosh's voice in her head again, and so it begins. Nice shot out the forward windows of the Minbari cruiser with the Jatok. Nicely done, effects crew. On the station, Franklin hears smashing glass and wakes to investigate. He finds Kaylin passed out with a bottle of methazine that she'd asked for from him next to her. In MedLab, he discovers that she didn't overdose on it. It was her medication for a terminal illness, and she passed out from pain before she could even take what she'd used his ID card to get. His colleagues believe she has 6 months left. She was diagnosed before he arrived, and they'd assumed she'd left the station since. Singing is what's important to her. She feels she can help more than at home by singing to people here who are without hope. Lita meets with the new ambassador as they arrive back on the station and says that whilst before she didn't know of anyone who might have had a piece of Kosh, there is now a possibility that she wasn't correct. Kaylin has returned to the stage after treatment, but it seems Franklin is going to continue his walkabout, as he is pictured in a fractured state as he leaves her nightclub. The Aboriginal walkabout is the foundation of this episode, and basically what Franklin is expressing here is the sort of burnout many of us have probably encountered, where work or a relationship fills up so much of our lives that other things are pushed to the periphery, and we end up losing our sense of self. Somewhat ironic then that he should end up back in Medlab quite so quickly, but obviously he's not returning as such. Franklin's relationships with women in the show always seem a little shallow, and it was interesting that he immediately assumed Kaylin was a drug abuser rather than having a legitimate need for the substance she asked for. A little bit irritating character-wise, although in fairness her stealing his credentials isn't exactly on the up and up either, but clearly she's in a lot of pain all the time, and that's why she's drinking quite so much. It's also not really clear how the relationship was left, as he seems to be continuing his walkabout once she's back on her feet. The new Vorlon ambassador, who is apparently known as Ulkesh, not just Kosh, as he suggests, is inevitably tough to read, and you might excuse some of its behaviour if the Vorlons are indeed in mourning for Kosh, as Lita suggests, but the way he treats Lita is hardly humane. Interesting too that he turns up for the War Council meeting. It feels like he could be in the Vorlon equivalent of the Minbari warrior caste. Though I remembered his ship doing it, I'm not sure why it saluted Sheridan in the way it did, unless it was just telling him to get back inside. Notice that the ship's coloration is different to Kosh's too, although it seems to be the same class. Perhaps the Vorlons are now on a different footing politically, having engaged the Shadows a few episodes ago. We knew that Lita was able to carry Kosh, and clearly Ulkesh had hoped some part of him was with her, and his suspicion of her may stem from the fact that he saw a human outline with the Shadows. But as we see from both her reaction to being told of Kosh's death and her closing remarks to Ulkesh, she genuinely doesn't have a piece of him, but over the course of the episode comes to form a belief that there might still be some fragment of him in Sheridan. Sheridan's own explanation makes sense here. We know the two had a bond, and that when Sheridan was sleeping, it was the ideal time for Kosh to reach out to him. So maybe through that link he was able to plant something of himself in Sheridan's mind, even at a distance. What that would mean for Lita and the Vorlons is not clear, however. It's good to see the Jacon again, likely the best Narn ship still fully operational at this point. But as Garibaldi points out in no uncertain terms, it's only operational because Sheridan protected it. So he really does let Jakar have it when he's reticent about ordering it to help Sheridan. And this is another example in this episode where Garibaldi, like Ivanova, is supporting Sheridan in their own way without being told to. Sheridan is perhaps not used to being questioned or reaching out, but he needs their experience and would be foolish to ignore it. So, was Sheridan's experiment a good idea? Yes and no. Going with just the White Star was supremely risky given how fast the Shadows can move. As Ivanova pointed out in the War Council, their other victories against mainline Shadow vessels were essentially down to luck. In theory, a fully functioning Shadow vessel doesn't miss its target. Going in with a P5 also seems undesirable when Minbari telepaths are also available. Indeed, it's Lita's initial attempt to jam that alerts the Shadow vessel to their presence. It's only because of what she sees in John's mind that she's able to focus enough to lock the ship down. Perhaps the most unwise decision is taking the jump engines offline to Yamato, the Shadow vessel. Even less helpful is the fact that it takes Lita 10 minutes to pipe up about them getting a distress signal off, as they could have been running at sublight speed during that period. And when the seriously heavy reinforcements arrive, all they can do is run at sublight. The one plus side of the jammings is that the ship didn't even get its fighters off. So the theory is indeed massively proven, but it's going to tie up a lot of individual telepaths in order for it to work on a bigger scale, and the maths wasn't on Sheridan's side even in this episode. Only the timely arrival of the Jacon and then the support fleet allowed him to get away with it, but notably this is the first time beyond the Babylon 5 defence fleet that we've seen an allied fleet like this. Technical nitpick? It's previously been mentioned that the Jacon class heavy cruisers tend to chew up their reserves opening a jump point, so I'm not quite sure how it could fire its primary weapons quite so quickly after emerging from the jump point, but I imagine they knew they needed to come in firing, and maybe they even had another ship open the jump point for them for that reason. I like the use of a background nebula here, because although the shadow ships are visible against space, it just makes sense to have that little bit of background colour to make it more obvious for the viewer. So the Shadows lose 2 of their capital ships in this engagement, which is probably quite a big deal for them, but they do now get the benefit of knowing that this tactic is available to the younger races, because most of their impacted ships do make it out. I get the distinct impression that Sheridan has ramped up his own mindset for this conflict now, maybe after the events of the 2 parts of War Without End. Even Delenn isn't heavily involved here, but it's nice to see him have a little moment with Lanier after the victory. So, very contrasting parts of this episode when all's said and done. The Franklin story feels like filler, whilst the White Star sequences are hardcore space battle goodness. Leave it to JMS to bring the two together like this. And of course, there's the Swedish Meatballs reference, which has ever been a fan favourite. Also, shout out to Patricia Tallman here, who is actually critical to how things play out in this episode, and she gets to use a sweary word that I definitely didn't remember from the first time round, because Channel 4 in the UK would have cut it out. Very clever to show the little bleed from her eye to indicate just how much strain it took to hold the Shadow ship. Nice to see Sheridan looking after her too, even when they come back to the station and he suggests she go to MedLab to be checked out. All nice touches. So some nice progression in this episode as we head towards the end of Season 3, and for me, 2021. I'll see you in the new year. Cheers for now.